So we continue on our journey with institutionalization by looking at page 57. And on page 57, Berger and Lechman say, at this stage, one might ask what gains accrue to the two individuals from this development that we've been talking about. The most important gain is that each will be able to predict the other's actions to some extent. Right? A little commentary there for you. Concomitantly, the interaction of both becomes predictable, again, to some extent. The "there he goes again" becomes a "there we go again." This relieves both individuals of a considerable amount of tension. They save time and effort not only in whatever external task they might be engaged in separately or jointly, but in terms of their respective psychological economies. Their life together is now defined by a widening sphere of taken-for-granted routines. Many actions are possible on a low level of attention. Each action of one is no longer a source of astonishment and potential danger or conflict to the other. By the way, it doesn't mean that the actions that become institutionalized or the taken-for-granted routines are always beneficial to each of the individuals that we're talking about, each of these actors. In fact, it might be quite detrimental. But the reason why it's institutionalized is because they become taken for granted routines that are no longer surprising and no longer a source of potential danger, at least perceived danger. It might be very real danger, but not necessarily perceived. Instead, much of what goes on takes on the triviality of what to both will be everyday life, for better or for worse. This means that the two individuals are constructing a background in the sense discussed before, which will serve to stabilize both their separate actions and their interaction. All right? Stabilizes their separate actions and interaction because it relies on a set of taken-for-granted routines that are no longer surprising and no longer of unknown danger. The construction of this background of routine in turn makes possible a division of labor between them, opening the way for innovations, which demand a higher level of attention. Right? So this is a very positive spin on what institutionalization can do. And I'd like to just point out as a little bit of a critique that this is maybe too much of a positive spin. Right? So let's continue then. The division of labor and the innovations will lead to new habitualizations, further widening the background common to both individuals. In other words, a social world will be in process of construction, containing within it the roots of an expanding institutional order. So earlier we talked about a social order. Now we're talking about an institutional order. All right. So this taken for granted routines, lack of surprise, known danger or potential for that, stabilization of action and interaction, and then the opportunity for new or unique behavior that relies on these taken for granted routines. What happens when you become someone's teacher, for example? What are the taken for granted routines that go along with that? What are the things that become no longer surprising or potentially dangerous? All right? Or at least no new dangers. What sort of stabilization occurs that allows for new thought or new activity or different approaches to emerge? If we move on to page 58, Berger and Lechman say the appearance of a third party changes the character of the ongoing social interaction between A and B. So far with two people, we were talking about the origin or the establishment of an institutionalized phenomenon. Now, with three, we're talking about what happens after that. So the appearance of a third party changes the character of the ongoing social interaction between A and B, and it will change even further as additional individuals continue to be added. The institutional world, which existed in statu nascendi in its original form, in the original situation of A and B, is now passed on to others. In this process, institutionalization perfects itself. That is a huge statement there, and maybe a little bit, again, too positive, but they're right. So the institutionalization process, maybe perfect is too strong a word, but establishes itself or begins to take itself for granted. That might be a better way of saying it. Let's continue. The habitualizations and typifications undertaken in the common life of A and B, formations that until this point still had the quality of ad hoc conceptions of two individuals, now become historical institutions. With the acquisition of historicity, these formations also acquire another crucial quality, or more accurately, perfect a quality that was incipient as soon as A and B began the reciprocal typification of their conduct. This quality is objectivity. So, the reciprocal arrangement, the reciprocal typifications between A and B become habitualized, right? And then, when there's a third party or more introduced to the process, what they already had going on becomes historicized, if I can use that word. I'm not sure that is a real word. Meaning that it becomes something that existed in the past and is not necessarily being created new, because it itself now has become taken for granted. So it becomes objective in some way, because it isn't reinvented by the addition of the third party. The third party comes into the institutional process or the institutional institution itself, and then sees that as an existing entity. This means that the institutions that have now been crystallized, for instance, the institution of paternity as it is encountered by the children, are experienced as existing over and beyond the individuals who happen to embody them at the moment. That's important. So the institutions now become more than the individuals that make them up. In other words, the institutions are now experienced as possessing a reality of their own, a reality that confronts the individual as external and coercive fact. So now the institution itself becomes an entity, and individuals, even individuals that are within or a part of or contribute to that institution, become external and coercive facts, because we know that individuals act on their environment to structure it to their particular needs. So institutions become objective realities that then must be dealt with by these individuals. All right. If we think of education again, education becomes an institution once it becomes historicized and we have anyone beyond those original people who created it as a system or an institution in a particular community. Anybody who comes after that fact comes into it as an objective sort of reality. I'm using air quotes here again, because the institution has been crystallized independent of the individuals that are in it at that time. So it becomes objective in the sense that it exists apart from the individuals, although it may be acted on by the individuals and certainly may be built upon by the individuals as some sort of taken for granted objective reality. Page 59, they understand the world that they themselves have made. All this changes in the process of transmission to the new generation. The objectivity of the institutional world thickens and hardens, not only for the children, but by a mirror effect for the parents as well. The "there we go again" now becomes "this is how things are done." That is enormous. A world so regarded attains a firmness in consciousness. It becomes real in an ever more massive way, and it can no longer be changed so readily, because it becomes "this is the way things are done." It becomes tradition. And traditions are often very hard to break. For the children, especially in the early phase of their socialization into it, it becomes the world. Right? Children live in that taken for granted set of expectations that embody the institutions in their world, school, family, community in particular. For the parents, it loses its playful quality and becomes serious. For the children, the parentally transmitted world is not fully transparent. Since they had no part in shaping it, it confronts them as a given reality that, like nature, is opaque in places at least. In other words, they don't know all of the different particulars that created that institution, in our case, the institution of education. We have repeated that process enough times that really none of us can completely see through everything that embodies our education institution. It is only at this point that it becomes possible to speak of a social world at all, in the sense of a comprehensive and given reality confronting the individual in a manner analogous to the reality of the natural world. Only in this way, as an objective world, can the social formations be transmitted to a new generation. Reality, then, results from institutionalization of habituated behaviors. Oops. That is important. Where is curriculum when we talk about the institution of education and the habituated behaviors? Key question for you. Where does curriculum exist there? And how does the institutionalization of education within national education systems, formal mass education systems worldwide, exist? Well, we move on to the idea then of objective reality, right? We've got reality results from the institutionalization of habituated behaviors. They go on to say on page 60, the process of transmission simply strengthens the sense of reality, if only because, to put it crudely, if one says this is how these things are done, often enough, one believes it oneself. So, have you ever heard anybody say that? I have. Right? If you say something often enough, it becomes the truth whether it is or not, because people begin to believe it. If we say over and over and over again that eating carrots is good for your eyesight, it becomes the truth whether or not it can be medically shown to be true. Right? Doesn't mean that it becomes the real reality. What it means is that we believe it as if it was reality. Further on, page 60, an institutional world then is experienced as an objective reality. It has a history that antedates the individual's birth and is not accessible to his biographical recollection. So it exists before the individual's now. It was there before he was born. It will be there after his death. This history itself, as the tradition of the existing institutions, has the character of objectivity. It might not actually be objective, but it has the character of objectivity. Since institutions exist as external reality, right? They're not inside of us. They are part of our environment that we then act on and structure ourselves to some degree. Since institutions exist as external reality, the individual cannot understand them by introspection. In other words, we can't get to a greater understanding of education as an institution by, thinking deeply inside of ourselves, because it exists outside of us. So, he must go out and learn about them, just as he must to learn about nature. So, the organization, the institution of education itself becomes an environment that humans live in. And we've already talked about the fact that humans can structure and act on their environment. So in the same way, we can have an environment that is education, and we can structure and act on that to create a reality for ourselves. This remains true even though the social world, as a humanly produced reality, is potentially understandable in a way not possible in the case of the natural world. All right. Why is that important to understand? I'm just going to see if there's one more thing that pops up here. Nope. Why is that important to understand? It's huge to understand, because now we have established how an educational institution, the institution of education is a better way to say it, has become an environment that humans then act on to structure and create their own reality. And by virtue of that, it can be used, this institution of education, to reproduce realities or to create new realities for humans. And we can do that to and by ourselves within the bounded rationality, within those limits of the institution that we talked about a couple of screencasts ago. All right, we're about to move on to the objective reality of public education. Come back for the next screencast.